The billionaire, Charles Lennox, was a man accustomed to power, precision, and predictability. His world was one of gleaming skyscrapers, conference calls with heads of state, and decisions that influenced markets. But that world shattered 2 years ago when his only son, 9-year-old Alexander, was in a car accident that left him paralyzed from the waist down. Since then, Charles's life had narrowed to a sharp point, a relentless focus on finding the best medical care, therapists, and specialists money could buy. But for all the science and technology at his disposal, he couldn't buy back his son's smile. Alexander had become quiet, distant. The once energetic boy who used to run through the halls of their penthouse now sat silently in a wheelchair, his large eyes dulled by grief and frustration. Charles, though outwardly composed, was consumed by guilt and helplessness. He threw himself deeper into his business, convinced that working harder might distract him from the quiet pain that filled his home. Charles hired a team of professionals for Alexander: private nurses, occupational therapists, even a counselor trained in working with children with trauma. None of it seemed to make a difference. Then came Miss Harper. Elizabeth Harper was unlike anyone Charles had ever met. In her early 30s, with a natural warmth and a gentle, steady voice, she was a special education teacher with experience in dance therapy. She was hired reluctantly, not by Charles, but by his sister, who argued that perhaps what Alexander needed wasn't more doctors, but someone who could reach his heart, not just his legs. Charles, though skeptical, gave his grudging approval, setting limits: 3 afternoons a week, strictly supervised. At first, Elizabeth's presence felt like an intrusion. She didn't dress in the professional blacks and grays of the other specialists, she wore bright colors and soft cardigans. She brought music into the sterile therapy room, played games, read stories, and, to Charles's surprise, she never once mentioned physical therapy. Instead, she just talked to Alexander. She asked him questions. She listened. And, slowly, he began to respond. Charles noticed changes he couldn't explain. A quiet laugh echoing down the hallway. Music playing softly from Alexander's room. One evening, when Charles came home earlier than usual, he caught a glimpse of them through the partially open door: Elizabeth sitting cross-legged on the floor, guiding Alexander's hands in rhythm to a song playing on a speaker. His son wasn't smiling, not quite, but there was a look of concentration and connection that Charles hadn't seen in months. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Friday afternoon. Charles had returned from a meeting earlier than expected. His usual presence would have been preceded by a housekeeper's warning or a text from his assistant, but this time he arrived unnoticed. As he made his way toward Alexander's room, intending to peek in briefly before heading to his office, he heard music drifting down the hallway. Not just music, laughter. He paused outside the door. What he saw stunned him. Elizabeth was dancing. Not in the formal, restrained way Charles might have imagined from a therapist or teacher, but fully, joyfully, with abandon. She twirled, stepped, and moved with a rhythm that lit up the entire room. But that wasn't what shocked him. It was what Alexander was doing. Though still in his wheelchair, Alexander was moving his arms in time with hers, spinning the chair in small circles, clapping, beaming. Elizabeth leaned close, holding his hands, guiding him through the motions. At one point, she stepped back and said, "Your turn to lead." And to Charles's utter astonishment, Alexander moved with purpose, taking the lead in their makeshift dance. Charles felt a tightness in his throat. He stood there, unnoticed, unable to look away. The music faded, and Elizabeth knelt beside Alexander, who was panting from the effort but smiling so widely it brought tears to Charles's eyes. "That," she said, brushing a curl from his forehead, "was your best dance yet." Something cracked open inside Charles in that moment. A man who had spent his life solving problems with contracts and logic suddenly found himself facing a truth he couldn't quantify: healing wasn't always about fixing. Sometimes, it was about connection, presence, joy. He knocked on the doorframe, startling them both. Elizabeth straightened up quickly, embarrassed. Alexander turned, a flash of worry in his eyes, but it melted away when Charles smiled. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said softly, stepping into the room. That was beautiful. Elizabeth opened her mouth to explain, to apologize, unsure of what this powerful man might think about what she had done. But Charles held up a hand gently. How long has he been doing that? He asked, his voice a mix of wonder and disbelief. Elizabeth hesitated. Just a few weeks, she said. He started responding to the rhythm. So we started small. He's been leading more and more. Charles nodded, swallowing hard. Thank you, he said simply. Elizabeth gave a small smile, but her eyes were watchful. She wasn't sure what this moment meant, whether she would be reprimanded for stepping outside the usual boundaries. Instead, Charles turned to his son. You were amazing, he said. I had no idea you could move like that. Alexander beamed. Miss Harper says everyone can dance. You just have to find your own way. Charles chuckled, kneeling beside his son's chair. That's a lesson I've never heard at a board meeting. They laughed, all three of them, and in that shared laughter, something shifted. A new chapter was beginning, one where healing wouldn't come from the next big innovation or a cutting-edge procedure, but from something far simpler, and far more powerful, human connection. Charles stood up and looked at Elizabeth with new eyes. She wasn't just a teacher. She was a bridge, a quiet, dancing miracle who had found a way to reach his son when no one else could. And though he didn't know it then, what happened next would change not only their lives, but the lives of countless others. Because sometimes, the smallest moments spark the biggest transformations. The billionaire stood silently at the doorway, watching the scene unfold before him. His son, Aidan, who had been paralyzed from the waist down since the tragic accident a year ago, was smiling, truly smiling, for the first time in months. Across from him, holding his hands and guiding his movements gently, was Miss Taylor, the young and passionate special education teacher who had been hired just 2 months prior. Music played softly from a speaker in the corner of the room, and although Aidan's legs did not move on their own, he swayed with her, supported by a harness system and a walker, laughing as if the weight of his condition had been lifted, if only for a moment. The billionaire, Thomas Grayson, had come straight from a high-level board meeting, still in his suit, unannounced and unexpected. He had never seen this side of his son with his own eyes since the accident. Most of his updates came from medical reports or brief check-ins with his household staff. But now, standing in the hallway, what he witnessed changed something inside him. He stepped inside. The soft creak of the door startled both Aidan and Miss Taylor, who turned around, her face immediately flushing with guilt. She let go of Aidan's hands gently and backed away, stammering. Mr. Grayson, I'm sorry, I didn't know you were coming. I was just. What were you doing? He asked, not with anger, but genuine curiosity. I was dancing with him, she said simply. We've been trying to stimulate his motor memory and work around the trauma through music therapy and rhythmic coordination. It wasn't part of the official program, but I thought, if I could get him to engage again, to feel joy, she trailed off, uncertain. Aidan looked up at his father, eyes wide, as though bracing for him to be upset. But Thomas didn't raise his voice. He walked over slowly, kneeling beside his son. You like dancing, Aidan? He asked. Aidan nodded shyly. She makes it fun. Thomas turned to Miss Taylor again. And has it helped? Yes, she said, more confidently this time. When I first started, he barely made eye contact. Now he's interacting, laughing, even trying to stand longer during sessions. He told me he used to love music before the accident. I wanted to give him a piece of that back. Thomas stood up and looked around the room. It was simple but warm. Posters of inspirational quotes on the wall, shelves filled with sensory tools and musical instruments. Not the sterile environment he remembered from Aidan's hospital room. This place had life. Later that evening, after Miss Taylor had gone home, Thomas sat with Aidan during dinner. For once, he wasn't on a call or looking at his tablet. He asked about the songs they danced to, what kind of music Aidan liked now. The boy's face lit up as he spoke, animated in a way Thomas hadn't seen in over a year. That night, Thomas reviewed every report Miss Taylor had submitted. He read her progress notes, observations, and unconventional methods. There was no doubt, she had gone beyond the requirements of her job. She had invested herself emotionally, creatively, and perhaps even sacrificially into his son's healing. But more than that, she had made Aiden feel like a child again, not a patient. The following week, Thomas asked Miss Taylor to meet him in his office. She arrived nervously, unsure what the purpose of the meeting was. She had feared a reprimand, maybe even termination. Instead, Thomas thanked her. Most people I've hired for my son's care have done their job. But you gave him something none of them could, hope. Miss Taylor smiled, unsure how to respond. Thomas continued, I want to expand this program. Not just for Aiden, for other children, too. I have resources, influence, and funding. What I don't have is your heart, your expertise, and your courage to try something different. She blinked. Are you saying? I'm saying I want to build a center. A therapeutic arts and rehabilitation facility, music, dance, play therapy. I want you to help lead it. The offer overwhelmed her. She had never dreamed of something like this. She had just been trying to help one boy heal. The months that followed were a whirlwind. With Thomas Grayson's backing, the Aiden Center for Expressive Therapy broke ground on the outskirts of the city. Miss Taylor, now promoted to program director, assembled a team of specialists, art therapists, music therapists, pediatric physiotherapists, and special educators. Every room was designed not just for function but for joy. Walls were painted with murals. Soundproof music rooms were built with adaptive instruments. Dance floors were equipped with harness supports like the one Aiden had first used. News of the project spread quickly. Parents across the state reached out, desperate for something different for their children. Donations poured in from philanthropists and corporations, moved by the story of a teacher who dared to dance with a paralyzed boy, and a billionaire father who saw the power in that act. As for Aiden, he continued to improve. While he remained paralyzed, he gained upper body strength, better posture, and, more importantly, confidence. He became a junior ambassador for the center, sharing his story with new children who arrived nervous and unsure. It's okay, he would say. Dancing helped me, too. At the grand opening of the Aiden Center, hundreds gathered, patients, families, staff, donors. Thomas stood on the stage with Miss Taylor and his son. As he looked out at the crowd, emotion filled his voice. After my son's accident, I thought we had lost everything. But one teacher helped him find joy again. She didn't give up. She didn't ask for anything. She simply gave. Today, we open this center in the spirit of that gift. Miss Taylor hugged Aiden tightly as applause rang through the crowd. The music began to play. And this time, it wasn't just one child dancing, it was dozens. Children with wheelchairs, crutches, braces, all swaying, spinning, laughing. And among them, in the very center, Aiden danced. Cue.